Hello and welcome to this episode of Leadership Guest Practices with me, Jeremy Blain. And what a treat we have in store for you today. The traditional domination of men in business, in sport, leisure and more is being challenged as female leaders continue to break down old barriers. We've seen this at very senior political levels, with female leaders making a real difference tackling the pandemic. Think Iceland, Finland, New Zealand. But there's still a long way to go, particularly when turning our attention to those leaders breaking the bias, misogyny and casual gender discrimination in sport, particularly football or soccer depending on where you are in the world. And this is on the terraces and on the pitches. It can be even tougher in those environments, but what makes it work is when everybody is on the same pitch, playing for the same team in gender biased terms. That means men stepping up as advocates and women's voices being louder and more central to progress, a combination which can start to accelerate the journey. As demonstrated by Lewes Football Club on the edge of the South Downs in the UK, a club I can promise you will start to hear more of in the future. An enlightened, fan and community-owned club that puts diversity, equity and inclusion at the heart of their strategy, their culture and their teams. My guests today are elected co-director of Lewes FC, Karen Dobres, and Joe Vines, the assistant manager of Lewes FC's men's first team from the club management side. Karen, Joe and the team are passionate about kicking gender discrimination, casual misogyny and violence against women and girls into touch. They are active outside of the club in the wider game and with a broad range of organisations with mutual focus and passion for the same. As an example, Lewes FC is the only football club in the world to pay its women the same as its men. The next battle is equalising the terms across other clubs, competitions and more. Karen, Joe and the whole club are behind this 100%, as are the 2,300 fan and community club owners locally and from 37 countries across the globe. So let's hear more about that and about their journey. Hello and welcome to this episode of Leadership Guest Practices. I'm delighted to be joined by Karen and Joe. Thanks very much for joining me. Karen, let's start with you. Could you introduce yourself, your leadership role at Lewes FC and your passionate stand for breaking the bias?
Definitely. Thanks for having us, Jeremy. So my name's Karen Dobres. I'm an elected director at Lewes Football Club. In terms of my leadership role, we're an unusual football club in that we have a whole pillar on the leadership role devoted to our impact on the world. More about that later, but I lead on our impact on the world and I'm involved in our financial sustainability and also in our engagement with our fans and community. And in terms of my stance, in terms of breaking the bias, I just believe that everybody should have a fair chance in life, whether that's on the football pitch or anywhere else. And it shouldn't be dependent on any of their inherent characteristics such as gender. That's what I believe.
I love that, Karen. A fair chance for everybody. Beautifully said. And I'm really looking forward to hearing more about the impacts on the world. And maybe now's a great time to bring in Joe to introduce yourself and your role at the club, Joe. And I'd love to know how the men's and women's team are doing actually at the moment at Lewes FC, Joe, and particularly how you are actively supporting the drive to remove gender discrimination from the terraces and the pitch.
Yeah, so Joe Vines, I'm the assistant manager of the men's first team. The men's first team at the moment are in 5th place, hanging on to that final playoff position, and the women's team are 8th in the women's championship. So, you know, both sides having a relatively good season so far. You know, the men's team are supporting with a movement at the moment to really try and address the issues surrounding you know, violence and misogyny against women by pushing forward and standing firm alongside them as well. So I expect we'll talk more about that as we progress.
Yeah, and it's a very important part of it, the violence against women and girls. It's at the heart of what you're doing. And Karen, Lewes FC also from a gender perspective is the only club in the world to pay its women players the same as its men. How did you make this happen? And what barriers did you have to break down to make it a reality, as well as the rest of the discrimination elements that you were trying to tackle at the same time?
Well, It's a big story. Back in 2000, I'm going to go back to 2009, 2010, just after the global financial crash, when Lewes Football Club actually became community owned in 2010 in order to make it sustainable financially. And it was taken over by 6 fans who bought it for a nominal fee, paid off all the debts, and then sold shares in the club for £30 to each person. Everyone who bought a share, and this is still the case, gets one vote as to who should be a director on the board. Therefore, the board has a democratic mandate. At the moment, we've got 2,300 plus owners in 38 countries around the world. Why is that, right? Why are people in Chile and Japan and Switzerland and recently in the Philippines, why are they buying shares in Lewes FC down in East Sussex, right? A relatively small club. Well, the thing is that in 2016, our women's team were doing fantastically well. They were zooming up the leagues and playing brilliantly. And directors actually questioned, why are we, when we're apportioning our budget, playing budget, giving more to the men's team than we are to the women's team? And the reason they questioned that and questioned gender equality in football, and you have to understand, this is a radical question. Bear in mind, we're the only club in the world to split our resources equally between men and women. So it's pretty disruptive, shouldn't be, but is. They asked that question because they have a different agenda. And that agenda comes from the community ownership. So rather than, we're a not-for-profit, so rather than making profit for private shareholders, we're actually trying to create value for community around us and look for issues that we can actually change through the vehicle of football for the communities around us. And they may not be people who already like football. They may be people who have been, let's say accidentally, but it's not really accidentally, excluded from football for many years for one reason or another. One of the examples of that is women. We'll come to that later. So the way the decision was made was a sort of noticing, an awareness, and then absolutely simply a decision. So directors, 2 directors stood, and they were men, 2 male directors stood up and they said, if you vote for us this term, because there's an elected term of 3 years, if you vote for us this next term, we will be introducing gender equality. So bear in mind that if you do vote for us, that's what will happen. And on that basis, they were voted in, and the whole board, made the decision to split those resources equally. And that made international and national headlines. And before you know it, there was a massive buzz around the club. It's important to say that they raised the women's budget to meet the men's. So there was a cost involved, but they took a punt on that. And 2017, July, that is what happened. And that's actually when I got involved, because I wouldn't be involved in a football club unless there was a lot of meaning attached to it for me. So yeah, that's how it happened. And you asked about barriers and challenges. And I suppose the biggest one was the economic one, the argument that critics did have, because most people said, that's amazing what you're doing, that's brilliant, why didn't we think of it before, hadn't thought about it. And but some people said, well, you shouldn't pay the women the same as the men because they don't get the same crowds as the men. And this is true, right? This is not a social justice argument, but it is an economic argument, right? If you're putting your sponsor on a shirt and you're only getting 100 people to come to the women's match, then the sponsor's not going to pay as much, are they? It just doesn't make sense. But how we responded to that was, well, with putting equal marketing behind the women as well, because everyone concentrates on pay, but it's actually the fact that they play on the same pitch as the men, they get the same marketing as the men, they get the strength and conditioning, they get the analysis, they get the nutrition, everything, right? So if we put the same marketing behind and let people know that there's a match, advertise it, talk about it, write it up afterwards, all the things that don't always happen with women's football, right? If we do that and we target some markets very carefully, and we did, then we can answer those critics who say we don't get the same crowds. And in 2 seasons, I'm very happy to tell you that not only were both first teams promoted, the men into the Isthmian League that they're in now, and the women into the Championship, the second highest tier of English women's football, but also we quadrupled the gate figure for the women's crowds. So it got to an average of 586. The men at that point had also improved their crowd to 610. And you could see that the figures were more or less aligned. So that's what happens when you actually put your is it your money where your mouth is? Your money where your mouth is. Yeah, that's what happened. So that's how we introduced it. And the main challenge was critics who were basically saying they don't deserve it, and getting over that challenge and introducing a new market to women's football. Yeah.
Wow, so much that came out of that, and I now really understand the impacts on the world. And what a fantastic story of community ownership, and these 2,300 owners, or 2,301 actually, Karen. There you are. Now
I like your owner's hat, Jeremy.
Yes, absolutely. And my pin. I'm a very proud owner. Part owner of Lewes Football Club, and what a fantastic way not just to engage the community, but clearly engage the teams in such an exciting journey. It's had an impact on them for sure, how they've been promoted. And what you were talking about in terms of challenges, it just reminded me of men's and women's tennis and the debate that's been going on there as well, over years and years. Very, very similar. And I think, the whole thing, it just takes, it takes some courage for somebody to step forward and say, this is what we're going to be. There will be critics, but we're going to drive through that, and we're going to do those things that actually start to boost the game. And just one more thing before I bring Joe into this, because you mentioned before we came on air here, that you've got a big game for the women's team against Liverpool coming up. So what's that going to do to your gates?
Well, we're hoping to set a record attendance, actually. Lewes, is a relatively small club compared to Liverpool. It's a very small club compared to Liverpool. Let's be honest, Liverpool FC. It says Liverpool were relegated to our league last season, which tells you something about what Liverpool FC think about their women's team. I'll just leave that there. But they're in our league. We're playing them on the 1st of May. We're hoping to set a crowd of over 2,000. When we played Manchester United in 2018, we got a crowd of 1,954. That was an excellent match. Helen Pankhurst turned up to that, the great-granddaughter of Emmeline Pankhurst, because we put Emmeline on our poster. And she did a little talk. And we had great fun with Manchester United's Barmy Army. But if we're asking people to come to our match against Liverpool, which we should do on the 1st of May, kicks off at 2:00, we should say that not only are you coming to an amazing football ground that's actually been voted the #1 football ground to visit in a book that came out recently about Britain's 100 top grounds, you're also coming to a ground that has Prosecco on tap, that will have a feminist spoken word poet talking before the match, that has vegan pies and milk, as well as all the rest of the kind of pies and milk that you get. Also sometimes has women's football chanting practice, and things, breastfeeding areas, just a different kind of football ground that makes everybody welcome and not just half the population. And the reason that you should come, just carrying on now, I'm on a roll. The reason that you should come is not just to watch the football, but it's to make a point, it's to take a stand, it's to do something about gender inequality. Because if you come and support women's football, what you're saying is that women aren't inferior to men, that they deserve equal fame and fortune on the football pitch as men, and that you, just by coming through our turnstile, have done something about that. So thanks for the chance to invite people to our match, Jeremy.
That's okay. Well, I go back to something you said right at the very beginning about giving everybody a fair chance and making it a welcoming club for women and men, and putting all of these things in place. Prosecco on tap is a new one on me, I have to say. It just makes me so motivated about it. So great opportunity for me to bring back Joe into this. So when you kind of observe this happening and the rest of the club's board and management's passion for making a difference, Joe, how did it galvanize you and your team and the dressing room to get behind the drive, so particularly in the men's team? And what barriers did you have to break down to make progress?
I think I must admit that it seems when I joined, I've been here a year now, on the management side. I played for the club 18 years ago, and it was a very different place then. So with regards to breaking down barriers and the education of the men's team players, etc., very little, I must admit, because the structure was already there. What I've found in both my professional career and football is that awareness is the most important thing. So when I first started in, by trade, I'm a technology recruiter. And many years into my career, I realized there was a huge issue around the gender pay gap. It wasn't something that was spoken of. It wasn't an obvious, two people doing the same job in the same business with the same number of years experience, one being paid, one level and one being paid a huge amount less. And lo and behold, the person being paid less was a female. So having those conversations from the other side, in the corporate world, and having, dare I say it, very left-leaning tendencies, and saying, well, how is this fair? This doesn't make sense to me. So it's a question I've often asked. So when we were speaking about joining, myself and Tony Russell, the first team manager, when we were speaking about joining the club, and there were a lot of conversations and emphasis around that equality piece. Now, for me, equality is hugely important. Diversity is hugely important. But the way that you achieve that is by being inclusive. I think that is a more important word. The equality word is the word that we use as a club predominantly. But I think the most fitting way to describe the club is that it's an inclusive club. And that for me is the most important thing.
And that's great. And in fact, I've seen tweets from some of the players kind of talking about this as well, and quite actively on social media, which is great. And I really get what you're saying there, particularly when I put the lens of business on as well. That first element of awareness is so important. Then you're able to consider it, make a decision, and act positively within that. And I really agree with you. We talk about equity, equality, diversity, and you've got to have that spirit and action of inclusion, which really makes it happen in there. So thanks for sharing that, Joe. And Karen, coming back to you and getting kind of into a little bit more detail here. You have been, outside of what you're doing specifically at Lewes, you've been calling for urgent action to tackle casual and intended misogyny that remains in parts of football. And we know that to be true, be it in the grassroots or right up through to the Premier League and the national leagues. So tell us a little bit more about the #CallHimOut drive and how your staff and players are making a real difference in kicking casual discrimination and violence against women and girls out.
Well, the funny thing is that one thing leads to another, Jeremy, doesn't it? And once you introduce gender equality to football and make the ground and the matches and everything about it more inclusive, including, for example, our Twitter handles, we have Lewes FC Men and Lewes FC Women rather than just Lewes FC, because the women's team could get drowned within the men's team staff and et cetera, et cetera. So we try to make everything as inclusive as possible. But what we have, when we started to welcome unwelcome women back to football, because let's just quickly mention that there was a 50-year ban on women's football in this country at a point where they were actually getting crowds higher than men's. And, some people listening may know about that, but if they don't, please look up the history of women's football in this country and the 50-year ban, when women were told that gynecologically it was bad for them to play football, so they shouldn't play it. And they were banned from FA pitches and training with FA affiliated coaches. So when that ban was lifted in 1971, that had done a lot of damage, and a lot of women thought football wasn't for them. And you could forgive them for thinking that, because on the back of newspaper pages or on the TV, all you really saw, and it's largely the case today, was reports on men's sports, men's football. So it seemed to be a sport for men. I mean, when I was growing up at school, the girls didn't play football, the boys played football. So what we had to do was welcome unwelcome women back to football. And in doing that, we invited lots of women's groups and groups that empowered girls or women in some way to the Dripping Pan specifically and asked them to come in solidarity with the cause. And they did, and lo and behold, they enjoyed it and started to come back. So this group eventually became the SisterShips. And this is relevant because the SisterShips are a networking group associated with Lewes Football Club. So we mutually support each other. And in my Impact on the World role, I have relationships with all of those groups. So we're talking about people like the Girls Network, RISE, the domestic abuse charity, Brighton Women's Centre, the police, the Sussex Police have a He for She thematic scheme going on. We've got them. East Sussex Fire and Rescue want more female cadets. We've got them. She Rebel Radio, Thrive Women Business Group. We've got 16 or so of them. And basically I follow their social media accounts and we communicate a lot. We have an email group. And round about the time when there were these high profile murders and abuse and everything of women last year. So we're talking about Sarah Everard, Sabina Nessa, and the sisters that were killed in Kingsbury, Nicole and Bieber. Well, they were despairing. They were very upset, and all the SisterShips were kind of saying, this has to stop, enough is enough. When is this violence going to stop? And then when details emerged and the police were saying, well, you've got to hail down the bus, or you've got to dress differently or go in only lighted areas, it was like, why is the onus on us? Why isn't it on men to change? It's men who are perpetuating this violence. Why do we have to change our behavior? And we were all so upset. And I was thinking, but we're all talking to each other. It's like International Women's Day every day. We're talking to each other. There's no men involved here. And they're the ones that we need to take notice. And I thought, well, we've got a football, hang on, we've got a football club here. There's a load of men there. And there's an amazing men's team. Because I'll tell you something about Lewes FC men. At the beginning of this season, they just said, we want to be met. And this is down to Joe and Tony as well, the managers. We want to be male allies. We want to step up, and anything that we can do, just let us know. So I had just a sort of chat with Joe and Tony really, and we came up with Call Him Out. And that was about, so men taking responsibility and being accountable for little misogynistic behaviours or sexist behaviours that we all think are normal, right? Because we're all in this soup together. Me too, let me just say me too, right? So it's just about noticing them and understanding that they contribute to a culture where violence against women and girls has actually become normal and something for girls and women to worry about rather than men. So because these footballers that we've got, Lewes FC men, and do follow them on social media, because there are some amazing guys in that team. And they said, we're going to make public pledges on Twitter, and we're going to check in on ourselves, and we're going to say that if we see or hear this language in the changing room or anywhere else, we will call him out, hashtag. And anyone that wants to follow can follow and say the same if they're a man. And actually what's happened since Lewes FC men stood up and said this is that our town council in Lewes and our local Labour Party have passed motions for their male councillors and male members to hashtag call him out, which is incredible, right? We hope to start a movement, but what we would like is more football clubs to actually take this up, because those men are role models, you know? Those men are amazing role models. They're strong, powerful, doing the stuff that little boys dream of. So more footballers saying that they will call him out would be awesome. That's how it started.
Well, you know, what's interesting is when you go back to some of the things you said, first of all, it's really about challenging that narrative of old and creating your new narrative for now, alongside other sisterhoods, as you mentioned, and using the power of social media, not just within your community, but also getting everybody involved. And you talk about male allyship, something that I'm very heavily involved in personally from a business perspective as well. I understand how important that is. And Joe, I think that is really kind of brings you back in to just change the lens slightly. So what does the hashtag call him out mean to you as a man, to the staff and to the players of the men's team? And how have you encouraged active, willing and passionate action behind this from the team?
Yeah. And again, it sounds, there hasn't been a lot of encouragement. There didn't need to be a lot of encouragement. I I think when you consider, the matter of fact that, all of these crimes against women, the murder of those women last year, horrific. They were, as Karen mentioned, they're perpetrated by men, and there's no getting away from that fact. So, the issue often is, particularly in social media, which is an interesting space to operate, where you get all sorts of opinions, welcome or otherwise. A lot of men will come back saying, well, not all men. Well, we know that, that makes sense, but it's not about, oh, it's not me, I'm not involved in it. It's what value can you add by ensuring that, Karen and I spoke about this yesterday. You leave a train station late at night, a lady gets off the train at the same time as you. You're walking in the same direction. Now, 10 years ago, I would have had my headphones in, I'd have been walking home, I would have caught her up, gone past her, I wouldn't have thought twice. What I would do now is, I would ensure that I make enough noise along that street so that she knows that I'm there. Then I would cross over, or I would make a telephone call to somebody that I know, a normal chit chat. She's fully aware where I am and what I'm up to and what my sort of, what I'm aiming to do, which is to get home. Now, just having that level of understanding is really important. And again, having daughters of my own and listening to, the use of language, describing a young assertive woman as bossy, these microaggressions start really early on in a female's life, and they're not noticeable, but over time they chip away. So look, in terms of getting behind the movement, it was easy. It was, an instant. With regards to getting the men's team players involved, it was a choice. It wasn't something that was forced upon them. It was myself and Tony and the management team and the rest of the leadership. We're attaching ourselves to this because we believe it to be something really important and an opportunity for us to make a difference in a time where you're reading disgusting reports in the newspapers or online every day. So the boys jumped at that. There wasn't one of them that felt uncomfortable with the messaging. There wasn't one of them that really didn't want to put their weight behind it. It speaks volumes about the club. It speaks volumes about them as individuals. And for me, it's a no-brainer. I don't see why something like this should be unusual, which is why, Karen mentioned, why would other clubs not be involved in this? I really don't know. And I mean, that's a question for them. But they should be asking themselves this, because if we can get behind it and where, there are professional footballers in role model positions, they have the opportunity to really affect positive change now. So, I would implore them to get behind this and really, send the right message out to both, young men and women, that these things are not acceptable and it can't continue like this.
You're absolutely right, and both of you kind of well said around that as well. And the horrific violence that we've seen, as you so rightly pointed out, over the last 18 months against women just can't go on. And men have to be part of the solution as much as being part of the problem in cases as well. And what you're doing here in terms of getting everybody involved, getting that level playing field, really does start to affect that positive change, doesn't it? I'm really getting that message coming through both of you. It's almost an inclusive and equitable approach to change as well, and people on the same pitch, if you like, making sure that they're reinforcing the key messages, and the more people that are shouting it, the better. And particularly, I think, in the game, the football machine, if you like, is that having the men's team so actively and passionately involved, Joe, as you've been talking about, must at least raise the awareness and start people questioning where they are and how they want to get involved. Is that what you're finding from when you're getting feedback outside, Joe? Just to sort of clarify that point, are you getting actually kind of the message coming back in?
Yeah, I mean, I'm hearing it. Yeah, I think I mentioned before we started recording that, when I start having conversations about my involvement in the club, and people dig a little bit deeper, and obviously, I tell them about some of the initiatives that we're currently championing, that it really grabs people's attention, because it's not just about the bolt onto that is both the men's and the women's team at the moment are performing well in their leagues as well, but that's the nice to have part. Actually what we stand for, and the differences that we're trying to affect, is what really resonates when I'm having those conversations with people.
Wow, that's absolutely fantastic. And coming back to what you were saying, Karen, as well, is that in fact you're going beyond the locker room, beyond Lewes FC, beyond the football machine as a whole, and you're starting to impact politics, the community as a whole. So where are you setting your targets next, Karen?
I will answer that. I just want to say as well that it wouldn't be anything without the football. Okay, it's so important to say that if we weren't doing well on the pitch, we wouldn't have that platform for these messages, right? So the two things have to go, they're like twinned, they have to work hand in hand. And to answer the question, like we, as I said, we use football as a vehicle for social change, but the football is a football club. So the football is extremely important. It would be nothing without football. And football has so much power over hearts and minds all around the world, right? So if we harness that power through the football matches, then we can make better change. Because what we're really trying to do is change culture all the time, That's why it's hard, and that's why it takes time. It's season after season after season. We've got to a point now where the men's team are amazing and really standing up. That wouldn't have happened a few seasons ago. So it really is, I feel like it's a big deal. And where we're setting our sights now, to answer your question properly, is I suppose our main campaigning at the moment, coming from the gender equality side, is the FA Cup prize. So we would like an equal FA Cup prize for men and women. We have been campaigning about this for a few years now. At the point we started campaigning, the men were winning, I think, 3.6 million for winning the FA Cup, and the women were getting 25,000. That was when we started campaigning. Then they split the men's in half to 1.8 million. And now they've raised the women's cup prize by a few million. But what we actually want is absolutely equal FA Cup prize fund prizes. And we've made two models whereby smaller men's clubs, teams, and women's teams would benefit a lot more, because at the moment all the money goes to the top Premier League clubs, which for them it's a drop in the ocean, right? But for us, or for any smaller clubs or women's teams, it would be transformational. So we don't think that the FA Cup prize, is very fair at the moment. And if it really is for all, then they should look at anyone listening can look at the two models that we've put out very clearly on our website to make a more even distribution and make it more equal. And they can actually put their football club in and work out where it would be under one of our two models, which is a really interesting exercise. And most people find that they'd be better off, right? So that's it. That's one way that we're campaigning. Another thing that we're doing, apart from call him out, obviously, which we'd like, as I say, we'd like to start a movement of that, even like across the seas. That would be great, because lo and behold, gender inequality appears to be everywhere. The other thing is the anti-gamblification of football, Jeremy. And I don't know if you know about that, but we're certainly very big on that at Lewes FC. We support Carga and the Big Step, because we think it's absolutely shameful that so many big clubs wear gambling logos on their shirts and are sponsored by betting companies, because we're principled, and because we report back to our owners, who are all of our communities. We've turned down betting companies' sponsorship. We don't think it's good to introduce betting just to young people, to young boys and girls especially, as something fun to do and associate it with their favourite sport. It's wrong. And we know of terrible stories. In fact, Joe will tell you that our goalie on the men's side, Lewis Carey, is very passionate about this and talks about his own addiction that he's overcome. So yeah, the anti-gamblification of football is a big one for us. We're campaigning on that. And I would say the other thing that we really want to do, and that you can help us with, Jeremy, and maybe the people listening and watching right now can help with, is get more owners, because we'd like to become the most owned club, first in England and then in the world. Now we need to get, we've got just over 2,300 at the moment. We need to get to 4,000 to be the most owned in England. And then we need to beat Barcelona. Well done, looks very nice. That's South Downs Green, by the way. Anyone that comes to visit the Dripping Pan, we play in red and black, but our owners get special South Downs Green hats, because from our ground you can see the beautiful South Downs of Sussex. Very lovely. In a national park we are. So yeah, we'd like more owners. Sign up. It's £50 to become an owner. It's very easy to do on the website. And also tell people about what we do. Get behind us. You know, if you know anyone that's a philanthropist that wants to help us, all our money will go into game quality and campaigning. If we can get into the Super League with the women, get into leagues with the men, we'll have those bigger platforms, and people will never be able to say that it's wrong or uneconomic or uncool to be inclusive, because we'll have proved them wrong. So help us do that.
Well, we'll see what we can do. A few things that I can't agree more with you around the anti-gambling stance, as well as the broader actions that you're taking. And yes, let's get people involved. We'll make sure on the screen, in the last few minutes of the screen, there are links so people can get involved, find out more, become owners of the club. And particularly just maybe a final question for you, Joe, coming into that, because I think you both mentioned that, you know, this is going beyond the club's walls now. And maybe an interesting question, though, is that based on the size of your club versus the size of some other clubs, why this isn't happening more and more. So how can your team, Joe, who have been so active as advocates for the changes and the policies that you've introduced at Lewes FC, how can you continue to shout louder outside of Lewes FC walls into the wider game to get more of the big clubs involved?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. And I think, look, without getting too deeply into it, I think when you look at affecting change when it comes to representation, it's a really important, when you look at organizations, whether that's corporate organizations, and you're trying to have diversity and affect change within them, you have to look at the leadership, and you have to look at, so for example, if you look at Lewes and you look at the directors, it's a diverse group of people, you know, and there are men and women within that group as well, and people from different socioeconomic backgrounds and ethnicities. That's crucial. When you look at the makeup of some of these larger, you know, look at boardrooms as a whole, there will be a common theme running throughout that demographic. So I think it's about, you know, first and foremost, that representation. It's about somebody in a position of influence or power to be able to stand up and stand for this. So it really does start at the very top. You know, unfortunately, you know, coming in at the ground level doesn't help. So as Karen mentioned, you know, those two men, you know, in 2010, standing up and saying, look, by the way, you know, if I do manage to make it as a director, the change that I will make will be to ensure that the men's and the women's team are paid equally, right? These are the reverberations of those decisions by, firstly, the people to elect them, and secondly, for them to stand by their promises, which is an amazing concept in this day and age, right? People being elected for a promise they make and sticking by it. So I think for me, that's where the change can be really affected the most, is by those people that are, you know, making these those big promises, sticking to them.
Right, and that gives me an opportunity just to replay a few of the words, the phrases that have come out. So making promises and delivering promises, giving people a fair chance, you know, setting the club up as a fair chance. involving communities and the world, as we've heard as well, in terms of the ownership. Equitable and inclusive, as well as being welcoming as well, challenging the narratives of the old or the traditional narratives and creating your own with more people involved, getting everybody involved, leveraging the power of social media to heighten awareness, change the culture. You both talked about that, really. In fact, I think you talked about transformation, and maybe in parts that's what is needed. Change, embedding the change once you've transformed is the real key to do that, so that you're impacting everybody. And with what you're doing at Lewes FC to get to almost shame more bigger football clubs to get involved and start shouting way more loudly than they are, and do what you're doing out there to drive this sense of fairness, but also, as you talked about, the male allyship, which is so important on the journey there. And of course, as you know, just to reinforce what you said as well, Karen, it's really important that the investment continues so that you've got the game quality as well as the campaigning running hand in hand. Success on the pitch, success off the pitch. Look, both of you, thank you so much for joining me for this fantastic discussion. And Karen, just a quick one for people that just want to take a quick look. What are some of the links, or where should they go to get in touch and continue the discussion?
Well, follow us on Twitter at Lewes FC Men and at Lewes FC Women. Instagram is the same, at Lewes FC Men and at Lewes FC Women. If you're on LinkedIn, it's at Lewes Football Club. Facebook is Lewes FC Men and Lewes FC Women. And our website is lewesfc.com. Our website is amazing, by the way. Do go and have a look there, because there's a lot of news there. And once you become an owner, of course, you get the owner's app. And you've got an app, and you can attend I think there are about 5 weekly town halls, as in every 5 weeks, not 5 a week. And you can ask any questions of the directors and different people that work at the club. In fact, I think we've got one tomorrow. And our head of performance, Kelly Lindsay, is going to be speaking at that about what, how her football strategy and how she works. So that should be amazing.
Fantastic. And we'll make sure all of these are on the screen as people are watching this, for those tuning in. Take note. Joe, Karen, thank you so much. It's been fabulous.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining our Guest Practices videocast. Please do subscribe to our YouTube channel through the link below, or check out our website to access more in our current series of expert interviews.